Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Bem-vindos a mais uma mesa da Flip. Essa mesa chama uma cidade chamada Bom Conselho, que poderia ser traduzida como Good Advice. A gente queria agradecer as convidadas, a Kristen Roupenian, Sheila Heti. Elas vão ser mediadas pela Branca Viana, que apresenta o podcast Maria Vai com as Outras, da revista Piauí. E eu queria só avisar que essa mesa tem o apoio do Submarino e fazer um agradecimento especial para o Consulado Geral do Canadá em São Paulo. Obrigada.
Falaram, não. Boa tarde. Tá alto. Boa tarde, gente. Obrigada a todos. Obrigada, Fernanda, pelo convite. É um prazer estar aqui. E eu tenho só 2 avisinhos antes. Um é que a mesa vai ser em inglês, toda em inglês, a mediação também. E outra é que vocês podem fazer pergunta atrás da cadeira da frente do vizinho de vocês. Tem um papelzinho. Então, vocês podem fazer pergunta, levanta a mão, que o pessoal pega, traz aqui para eu poder fazer pergunta para elas. Tá? Façam perguntas que a gente gosta. So now, switching into English, just to introduce the two of them, when you just look at them like that, they seem to have a lot in common because they're both women, they're both white, they're both from North America. Sheila's from Canada, and Kristen is from the U.S. But actually, they have about the same age, I would guess. But actually, they're very different. They're very different writers. Their books are very different. At first sight, you would think that they both deal with gender issues, so that would be something that unites them. But actually, what they deal with in their books are universal issues, not really gender issues. They just happen to be women, so they have a different point of view. So Kristen Roupenian is American, as I said. This book is her first book of stories, this one here. It's translated into Portuguese as Cat Person and Other Stories. It's called You Know You Want This in English. And these are stories with a lot of humor, dark humor in many of the stories. There's a lot of violence. There's a touch of the supernatural, which I found very surprising. Just having read Cat Person, for which she is most known. And most of the stories just kind of bother us in a way that you don't really understand when you're reading them, but it's immediate. It's like a shock when you read it. And then you have to think about it to try to understand what is it that bothered you. You know, the characters stay in your mind. You keep thinking about them, the emotions that they have and that they act like under the spell of these emotions. These are things that we don't really usually want to think about, like resentment and envy and hatred, desire, and control and power. And Kristen became very well known when The New Yorker published her short story called Cat Person, which I suppose many of people here read. And Cat Person is about the relationship between a man and a woman who know each other very, very little and who get into this relationship primarily through text messages that they exchange. And after a few weeks exchanging text messages, they meet, they go on a date, and everything goes terribly wrong. From the first kiss to the last line of the story, everything goes really, really badly. It was published in 2017 in The New Yorker, as I said, so it was published in the middle of the Me Too movement, which meant that it was interpreted within that context as part of the Me Too movement. And this reading is one of the readings that you can have of this story, but it's not the only one. And it went viral, which is something that never happens to short stories. No short story goes viral. It is, I think, the most accessed story on the New Yorker's website, right? At least that year it was. Yeah. The reaction, at least the reaction that I saw here and what we read, was that it bothered men, which frequently becomes sort of defensive when you want to talk about Cat Person with them. But it also bothered women, including myself, because what it did was that it reminded women of nights that are very similar to what Margot, the character, goes through on this terrible date that she goes on. Nights where it's bad sex, it's nothing is going right. There's no actual coercion, but at the same time, you feel like there's no way out. Like you just can't get out of that situation. You just have to go through with it and get out of there as soon as possible. And it makes you feel icky afterwards. So if you read this book, and you all should go out and buy it, if you read this book thinking that it's all going to be about sexual politics and about men and women and Me Too, you are in for a surprise, because that is not the case at all. It's very hard to talk about your stories without spoiling the ending, but we're going to try, right? We're going to try not to spoil anything.
We could do it.
Okay, so Sheila is from Canada. She lives in Toronto, and this is her book. It's called Motherhood, Maternidade in Portuguese. And it is her 8th book, and it is the 2nd book in which the narrator is also called Sheila, just like her. The other one is called How Should a Person Be, and it hasn't been translated into Portuguese as far as I know. But not all of her books are what we now call autofiction. She has a historical novel, which is based on true characters. She also wrote a book of short stories that are sort of like fables or fairy tales or something like that, fantastical fables. She also is a playwright as well. And Motherhood is being, it was really, the translation into Portuguese is really, really good. It's by Julia de Bassi, very, very good translation. And she deals with something that we rarely see in literature, which is not exactly motherhood, like the title of the book, but the decision to become a mother or not become a mother. We read a lot about motherhood itself, for good or for evil, but we don't read a lot about how you make this decision of becoming a mother or not. There's a point in the book when the narrator says that all her friends got pregnant the same summer, and the narrator then wonders what happened that August, what call all the women heard that they all got pregnant. And the book has a lot to do with women's bodies. Some of the chapters are called ovulation and bleeding and PMS. And the mother and the grandmother of the narrator are also very important. I think even more important in her decision to become a mother or not than the boyfriend, who would be the father of the child. What this book made me think is that most women, including myself, usually just go into motherhood without thinking as deeply about it as she did, as the narrator did. Just as part of regular adult life, this is what you do when you become an adult. You, especially if you're a heterosexual woman, you get married, you have children, and that's it. And the character Sheila does exactly the opposite. She thinks about every single detail of becoming a mother, and that's why the book is so interesting. So I'm going to start with Sheila. Your narrator uses some unorthodox means to make this really big decision. She talks to psychics. She goes to a person who does divination on tarot cards. She consults her own dreams. And she uses the I Ching, the book, the Chinese book of divinations, through a method that she invents. Like, she throws coins, and then she asks the question to the coins, and the coins can only answer yes or no. But the questions become more and more elaborate. So she asks the question, she asks the oracle, for example, if she is possessed by a demon, and she asks if happiness is the opposite of despair, and then the coins answer yes or no. But she also asks the coins if her boyfriend thinks that her breasts are too small, and if he really wanted a girlfriend with larger breasts, and then the coins answer yes or no. So it's also a book with a lot of humor. So what I want to know is why you use the coins and how you incorporated it into your writing and your creative process, and explain what it is, like you do in the beginning of the book.
Sure. So there are these passages in the book where the narrator asks a question and then throws 3 coins, and if it's 2 or 3 heads, it's a yes, and if it's 2 or 3 tails, it's a no. And the questions become, as you said, more and more elaborate and go into all sorts of different directions. And the reason that I started writing this way is because at the time that I started writing this book, I had just finished writing How Should a Person Be? And I wrote that book in conversation with friends. So I would go out with my best friend Margot, and I would tape record our conversations, and I would transcribe them, and I was very interested in dialogue, in having another person to respond to. And when I started writing Motherhood, this question of whether or not to have a child was really preoccupying for me. And originally, it was actually going to be a book of nonfiction. I was going to interview women who had children, women who didn't, men, people who were who couldn't decide, because I myself thought like I needed to see what different futures were possible. I needed to interview people so I could know what I wanted to do, whether I wanted to have a child or not. But then very quickly into this process, I started to realize that I wasn't going to get my answer by interviewing other people. So I sort of sequestered myself in my room, the way writers tend to do, but I still wanted a dialogue. I still felt like I wanted to be in conversation with something other than myself. So the coins originally were just a way of writing with a conversation partner. And the yeses and the nos are so surprising. And what I started to find, because I wrote that way for about a year or two, I started to find that it broadened my mind, because when you think about something, you always kind of tend to go down the same tracks. You make these sort of assumptions that you've always made. And I would ask a question of the coins, thinking that I was going to get a yes or a no, just according to how my mind would naturally go. And it always surprised me and led my mind into new directions and sort of broadened my thinking about this question. So, and I think, like you said, the coins also add humor, and they kind of take on this God voice. To me, the yeses and the nos seem to come from some very authoritative place, which is also so strange, but they're also kind of tricky and a little mean. Like, I think God is sort of probably authoritative, tricky, and a little mean. So the coins had this this authority that the character and that I was looking for, but it was a puzzling authority. Yeah.
And you actually really did throw coins and respect the answer. So the answer is the real answer that the coins gave you.
Yeah.
All this questioning with coins, with psychics, tarot readings, and dreams just gave me the impression of a certain loneliness in your of the character Sheila. That it was a very lonely decision, even though it's a decision basically for humanity and that should be shared, but it's not. It seems to be that she's all by herself trying to answer this question. Is that the case?
Yeah, well, I wanted it to be a philosophical novel, so I wanted her, even though there is this dialogue, I wanted her to seem to be wrestling alone. Like, I have this image of Jacob wrestling the angel in the book, and to me, wrestling with this question was like Jacob on the banks of the river in the middle of the night alone, wrestling this creature. And just like Jacob doesn't know if it's an angel or a devil, she doesn't know if this question is an angel or a devil. Like, to have to answer a question like, do I want a child, for those of us who have that question, you don't know if this question is a devil or an angel, if it's going to lead you into further and further separation from the rest of humanity just to ask that question rather than to take it for granted, or maybe lead you to a new place. Because I felt like the character wanted to come to really her own answer. And so part of the reason that it's so lonely is because we all have the answer given to us. Like, of course you're going to have a child, but if you step away from that answer and try to find your own answer, there's so much that you have to shut away from yourself. You have to shut out so many voices. And the act of shutting out all those other voices and trying to find your own ends up in a kind of private and lonely place. Yeah.
So, Kristen,
Yeah.
right? The first story in your book is called Bad Boy in English, right? And it's called Seu Safadinho in Portuguese, and it's a very violent story. It's probably one of the most violent stories in the book, if not the most violent stories. And there's you don't really describe the violence in a graphic manner, but we know it's there, and we know there's sadism, there's erotic perversion to the extreme. There might be necrophilia. I'm not sure, but I think so. That's how I understood it, at least. So it's really very shocking. So did you choose this story just to make it clear to the people who had read Cat Person when it went viral that this is not what you're going to get in this book?
No, I would say actually there's a definitive answer to that, which is that Bad Boy was the first story in the draft of the collection that I'd put together before Cat Person was published. So it was not in any way a sort of fuck you to people who read Cat Person. But I do think it had a kind of important positioning there in the sense that it's a story that moves very quickly from the world of the mundane, interpersonal interactions, dating. It sort of starts with this couple has a friend who's gone through a bad breakup, and he's kind of moping about it, and they get annoyed. So it starts in a really similar space as Cat Person, but then it veers off, as you said, into this much, much darker space. And it was really important to me when I was putting the collection together to let people know right away that they were in a collection where the stakes could vary wildly, where really anything could happen. And I felt like that story in microcosm sort of presaged the rest of the collection in moving dramatically from one space to the other. And what I wanted was, both there and in the collection as the whole, for the sort of more obvious horror elements to refract back and maybe make you see some of the more mundane details in a darker and more upsetting way. And it did feel, too, once Cat Person was out there, I knew from the beginning that I'd written a book that was maybe not what you would expect, and I felt like, well, either I could try and hide it, and people halfway through would get the book and be like, oh no, what have I bought? Or I could tell them up front what it was and let them make their own decision. So and both things were there.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could do your reading. You're going to read
Yes.
You're going to read an excerpt, right? Because it's an excerpt from a story called Biter.
Yes.
Just to give us an idea of the kind of, the kind of subjects that you deal with.
Sure. So I guess I should make clear this is not from the necrophilia sex story. This is from a much calmer story. This is actually from the story I read from when my parents were in the audience at my book launch. So it's much more PG-13 rated.
Sort of. Yeah.
And yet.
Sort of.
That is not saying much, because it's a story of a young woman named Ellie who, ever since she was young, has had a compulsion to bite people in a sort of semi-sexual way, but she's repressed it ever since she was a kid and learned that it was unacceptable. And so here in this very short section that I'm about to read, she's fantasizing about the possibility of actually biting one of her coworkers. Imagine it's late in the afternoon, past 5, dark already. The office is empty. Everyone but Corey and Ellie has gone home. Corey is loading paper into the Xerox machine when Ellie enters the room. She stands behind him, inappropriately close. He thinks he knows what is coming. He stiffens, preparing to politely reject her, not because he has standards for workplace propriety, but because he's already hooking up with Rachel in HR. Ellie, he begins, apologetically, as she grabs his forearm and lifts it to her mouth. Corey's lovely face contorts, first in shock, then pain. Stop it, Ellie, he cries out, but no one hears him. The tendons of his arm roll and snap beneath Ellie's jaws. Finally, Corey gathers his wits enough to shove Ellie away. She stumbles backward, lands against the stacks of copy paper, and slides to the ground. Corey stares at her in horror, clutching his bleeding arm. He's waiting for her explanation, but she gives him none. Instead, she stands up calmly, straightens her skirt, and wipes the blood from her mouth before she leaves the room. What does Corey do? Of course, he could run straight to HR and say, Ellie bit me, but after all, it was an office, not a preschool. Everything about the conversation would be ridiculous. Ellie, did you bite Corey? They would ask. And Ellie would raise her eyebrows and say, no, What a weird question. If the HR people tried to push and said, Ellie, these are serious allegations, all Ellie would have to say was, yeah, seriously insane. Of course I did not bite the office manager, and I don't know why he's saying that I did. Really, the odds were high Corey wouldn't say anything at all. He would stay in the copy room for a while, contemplating the situation, and then the next day, he'd decide that the easiest thing to do would be to pretend it hadn't happened. He'd show up to work in a long-sleeve shirt to cover the ugly bruise on his arm, the little half moon where she'd marked him with her teeth. And then part of Corey Allen's brain would be reserved for keeping track of where exactly Ellie was. She'd catch him looking at her in meetings, and when they were at office parties together, he'd continually be moving, trying to keep as far as possible away from her. In a way, it'd be like they were always dancing, even if he never spoke to her again. Months later, when no one else was watching, she'd grin and snap her jaws at him, and he'd turn ghost pale and hurry from the room. He would remember her for the rest of his life. They'd be joined by the glistening strands of his fear. That's all.
So thanks. And that's the PG-13 version of all your stories,
That's
right?
true.
One thing that called my attention in your female characters is that they are evil. A lot of them are like perverse, at least. I mean, the nicest ones are perverse, and many of them are very young. You talk a lot about the meanness and the evil that, or the power, which brings them power, of very young girls, adolescents and preteens and teenagers, and young women in general. Stories like The Night Runners, for example, which is set in Africa and at a school, and there's this white man who's teaching, and there are these girls in 6th grade, I think, so they're, I don't know, 11 years old or something like that. And they just bully him. They bully him out of Africa, basically. So do you think it's very rare to read about this kind of evil and perverse power that women can have, especially young women can have, in literature, especially if they're not punished for it? Because when you have like mean girls in movies, they're always either punished for it or they learn their lesson and they become really good girls. So that's not the case. So do you think this is a power that women have, and then they lose it later in life, or don't they?
I mean, certainly women have some power, and I think all of us, men and women alike, are continually trying to figure out exactly how much power we have and where and when it's possible for us to use it. I was glad you mentioned in literature, because I think absolutely that idea of the teenage girl kind of suddenly becoming too powerful, that's like a huge trope in the horror tradition, right? Like Carrie, suddenly her like sexual energy is so intense it's bursting out her eyes. Like that kind of power, I do think that we have a lot of ways of talking about it and even sort of demonizing it or mythologizing about it in the culture. But not without punishment. And I think also not, for me, the women in the stories, they have impulses, right? They have desires that are often hurtful. And I think one of the things I'm most interested in is, I think everybody wants power. I think that's a really kind of basic human desire, is to like be able to control your circumstances, or in some cases to be able to control the people around you. And part of growing up is learning when it's okay to do that and when it's not, and where that might be a safe kind of power to exercise and when it might like explode in your face. And the reason that one of my favorite characters in the book is Ellie from the story that I've just read is I felt like more than any of the rest, she wrestles with it. She like is very cognizant. She's like, I have this desire. It's wrong to bite people. What do I do? And the whole story is just kind of her thinking through that in a way that to me is where, if we're going to make ethical judgments of characters, it's not in your desires, because I think often desires are outside the space of right and wrong, but where they enter the world is how you learn how to deal with them. And I think teenage girls in particular are kind of told a lot of stories about the power they have and when it's right and wrong to use it. And a lot of the characters, like Margot, will oscillate really quickly between feeling totally powerless and feeling all powerful. And it's really hard to kind of find a middle ground. And so I think all the characters in one way or another are trying to figure that out.
Some of them have supernatural powers, right?
Yeah.
But we don't want to spoil anything. So Sheila, as I said in your book, at least I felt that the mother and the grandmother of the narrator are very important in her decision to become a mother or not become a mother, even more important than the boyfriend, because the boyfriend says, well, okay, if you want to have a kid, I'm okay with it. If you don't want to have a kid, I'm okay with it. Do whatever you want. He already has a child from a previous relationship. So in that sense, she's really alone. But then there's the mother and the grandmother, and you're also going to read a passage that illustrates that a bit, I guess.
So this is right near the beginning of the book. Okay. So. My mother cried for 40 days and 40 nights. As long as I have known her, I've known her to cry. I used to think that I would grow up to be a different sort of woman, that I would not cry, and that I would solve the problem of her crying. She could never tell me what was wrong except to say, I'm tired. Could it be that she was always tired? I wondered when I was little, doesn't she know she's unhappy? I thought the worst thing in the world would be to be unhappy, but not to know it. As I grew older, I compulsively checked myself for signs that I was unhappy. Then I grew unhappy too. I grew filled up with tears. All through my childhood, I felt I had done something wrong. I searched my every gesture, my words, the way I sat upon a chair. What was I doing to make her cry? A child thinks she's the cause of even the stars in the sky, so of course my mother's crying was all about me. Why had I been born to cause her pain? Since I'd caused it, I wanted to take it away. But I was too little. I didn't even know how to spell my own name. Knowing so little, how could I have understood a single thing about her suffering? I still don't understand. No child, through her own will, can pull a mother out of her suffering. And as an adult, I've been very busy. I've been busy writing. My mother often says, you are free. Perhaps I am. I can do what I like. So I will stop her from crying. Once I'm finished writing this book, neither one of us will ever cry again. This will be a book to prevent future tears, to prevent me and my mother from crying. It could be called a success if, after reading it, my mother stops crying for good. I know it's not the job of a child to stop her mother from crying, but I'm not a child anymore. I'm a writer. The change I've undergone from child to writer gives me powers. I mean that magical powers are not far from my hand. If I'm a good enough writer, perhaps I can stop her from crying. Perhaps I can figure out why she is crying and why I cry too, and I can heal us both with my words. Is attention soul? If I pay attention to my mother's sorrow, does that give it soul? If I pay attention to her unhappiness, if I put it into words, transform it, and make it into something new, can I be like the alchemists, turning lead into gold? If I sell this book, I will get back gold in return. That's a kind of alchemy. The philosophers wanted to turn dark matter into gold, and I want to turn my mother's sadness into gold. When the gold comes in, I will go to my mother's doorstep, and I will hand it to her and say, here is your sadness turned into gold.
So the book is about the decision of motherhood, but it's also about being a daughter and being a granddaughter and learning how to deal with these relationships. So what are the roles of the mother and the grandmother in the narrator's decision and in her life? They seem to me to pull in different directions.
Yes, well, the grandmother, the mother of the mother, went through Auschwitz and came out, and the family's Hungarian Jews, as mine is. And the mother's sadness is related in some sense to what her mother went through. And the daughter feels like, what do I owe my mother and what do I owe my grandmother, who have been through things that are unimaginable to me and that are so much greater than anything I'll ever experience? Like, do I owe them to continue the family line? Do I owe them children? The grandmother's no longer alive, but or is it enough to write a book to solve the sadness? Like, she kind of feels like something has been deposited into her lap. And it's interesting, I was doing this research about grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, And they say that it's the third generation that tends to deal with the pain of any trauma, really, any great thing like that, because the person who goes through it, they just can't deal with it, and the children are too close to it, and it's often the grandchild. So I read that research as I was coming to the end of the book, and I felt like, oh, that's so strange, but it's... Anyway, so she feels like she has to do something. She has a task, and she doesn't know what her task is. But it's related to her mother and her grandmother. And also, as in my life, similar to the narrator, the mother worked and was much more interested in working and being a doctor than she was in being a mother. And so the narrator asked the question of, like, what does it mean to be a mother? Is it just to do what you saw your mother doing? And she thinks, like, if I saw my mother spending all her time working, in her bed with her papers and her markers and her pens, and I do the same thing, am I also a mother? Is the imitation of what one sees one's mother doing a kind of motherhood? So.
But then would she be a mother or not? Because the mother is depressed, as you were just reading. The mother was crying all the time and was concentrated on her career. So on the one hand, you have the grandmother, and you have to continue the family line because of what the grandmother went through. But then the mother didn't really want to be a mother,
or didn't seem to enjoy it, or
didn't enjoy it. So she's pulled in two different directions in this sense, isn't she?
Yeah, and there's the question of, well, that mother's generation, that generation above, had even less of a choice. So would that mother have had children if she had been given the choice, instead of just having the expectation that, of course, you have children? So I think she's also thinking through this question as something that is her duty, because there's been no women before who have been in that position where they could ask that question. She's like the first more or less the first generation of women who can ask that question. So,
because it was just expected that you would have children.
Yeah,
nobody would delve into the question.
It would just be too radical. You'd really have to separate yourself to do that.
And is that how you feel as well?
I think
about
it's
your grandmother and your mother?
I'm not sure about them, but it's interesting when I was writing my book and I was looking to see other books or other cases of literature or philosophy where this question had been wrestled with, and I couldn't find anything. It's just such a new moment in human history that this is such a free choice, at least I have felt it to be that. My friend who did the cover of the Portuguese edition, she's a artist and a writer named Leanne Shapton. She did these beautiful covers for me, and she read the book, and she said, if men could have children, this question of whether or not to have children would have been the central question in philosophy. It would have been like when Plato, it would have been everything, every book would be about that. But, it's,
I mean, if they could get pregnant, right? If it was their decision to make. Yeah, that makes sense. So we have a question here. Yeah, that I'm seeing meanness in your characters where they aren't really mean, they're genuine. And if it's difficult to portray genuine women, and why? They might be right, actually. That I might be seeing meanness.
She said that. I see. Genuine. I think that all of my characters, men or women, start with like a feeling that is very real or that I hope that is genuine. It's usually something personal to me. But then often the situations in which they're placed are very extreme. And so then because of those situations, they're allowed or sort of driven to like pursue, like to delve into the darkest parts of them. And so I think while I have a special place in my heart for all of my characters, I mean, some of them commit murder, some of them torture. Like they certainly end up in places that are dark. But I do feel, and I want my reader to feel, that like even if you wouldn't make the same choices they made, that some fragment of them is identifiable and is something that like allows you to connect with them. I think that reading a story in which you can just like sort of point from afar and say, oh, this person sucks, is a boring reading experience. The most intense reading experiences are when you see yourself reflected and maybe you're like, ugh, I don't like that, but it still feels familiar to you. And so, yeah, and it's very, so for me, writing those kind of characters is very, I don't know any other way that I could do it. I think watching other people react to them and sort of the way that people will talk, I think, about female characters in particular and like the language of judgment that comes in does still sometimes surprise me, or that there's an idea that by writing a character, I'm endorsing a certain kind of behavior or criticizing it, as opposed to just saying, like, here is this thing, here it exists, here is a piece of humanity that is, like, maybe not ideal, but is nonetheless real. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the things that bothers us as readers, in a good way, is that we really do see ourselves in what the characters are doing, and they're not always laudable actions that they're taking.
Of course.
No, and actually, we must say that the men aren't exactly stellar either.
Oh yeah, that goes without saying.
It's not just the women. It's usually women aren't portrayed like that in literature. So this is a question for you from the audience, and it says, I read Motherhood and How Should a Person Be at the same time. And there's some recurring themes, places, and ideas, like you were revisiting what you wrote in How Should a Person Be. Actually, I had the same impression that I was reading about the growing up or the growing older of the same character. So do you go back to your previous work to analyze how much you have changed? And are there any other plans to continue in autofiction?
No, I don't go back.
Maybe explain what How Should a Person Be is, because...
Yeah, so the character in How Should a Person Be, the character in Motherhood doesn't have a name, but it's a very similar kind of person to the character in How Should a Person Be, a writer who lives in Toronto, who's, in How Should a Person Be, she was in her 20s, and in Motherhood in her 30s. These are the only two books that I've written in that form. And the reason that I wrote How Should a Person Be in that form was because I was really interested in reality TV when I started writing it, and specifically this program called The Hills. I don't know if
The Hills?
If you got that here.
No, I don't think
it was
so.
on TV, but it's sort of these very superficial young women living in Los Angeles, and it's very trivial. But I sort of loved that show because you couldn't really, they had their own names, but you couldn't tell whether they were themselves or whether they were acting themselves or whether they were acting scenarios that were given to them. And I was thinking about this at the time. It was 2006 when I started writing that book, and I wanted to write in that way where Margot, my friend, and I would be the characters. I would be able to play myself in life. So I created these scenarios for us, the same way that a director of a reality TV show would, I think. Create these scenarios and then live them and then write about them. And it was a way, the question that the book has, How Should a Person Be, was a question that I was asking myself at the time. I had just come out of a short and ill-conceived marriage, and I felt completely lost in the world, and like I didn't know what was up and what was down and how to be a good person or whatever. And so that book was a way of me trying to ask that question and to come up with an answer that I could be accountable to, and to be accountable to my friends who I wrote about. Because I'd never written about real people before, and I felt there was something unfair about writing a moral universe in which your characters all, in some sense, have your own moral compass, and they can't talk back to you. So the neat thing about writing How Should a Person Be was Margot, my friend who was a character in the book, would read drafts, and then she would come to me afterwards and say, like, the way that your character apologized to my character and then my character forgave her, like it would never work like that. Like that was a terrible apology, and it really taught me something. And then
would you rewrite it when she told you?
Yeah, I would rewrite it. And then when it came to write Motherhood, it seemed to me like, in the same way of the previous book, I had a question for myself that I needed to answer. This question of whether or not to have a child and what it meant, more what it meant not to have a child and how one can come to terms with not having a child. And so the form that the freedom that I had discovered in writing How Should a Person Be, I continued with this book. But the book that I'm writing now isn't like either of those. Yeah.
Yeah, in the end, her decision is, biology catches up with her in a way.
Yeah, she sort of like wants to keep writing the book until she can no longer have a child. So the decision will be made for her, can no longer have a biological child. Yeah, and there's this like question of like the book being like a raft that'll get her to the other shore without a child, you know. But and the raft can fall apart as long as it gets her to the other shore. Yeah.
And that also has to do with the question of time in your book.
Yeah.
You talk about the soul of time, which I would like you to explain. There's also very concrete time, like the reproductive life of your character ending.
Yeah.
Also the menstrual cycle as time in the book. But also you talk about the soul of time, which I'm not sure I understand, and I'd like you to explain it if you can.
Yeah, what I was thinking about, I had that phrase in my head, the soul of time, and I think what it means is that the problems of one generation, like the problem that the grandmother has, we think that the problems that we have to be solved by us in the moment that we're living and in our lifetime. But time itself has a different timeline than just our mortal lives. So this problem of the grandmother can be a problem that is solved or dealt with in a future generation. It may not be that the problems that we have need to be dealt with within our lifetime. That the time can sort of, or the problem can inhabit generations and many bodies. And we're sort of impatient to solve all the problems that we experience for ourselves, but that's a very egotistical and localized idea of time that I only have to the end of my life, you know, or the grandmother only had to the end of her life. But in fact, these things carry on and carry on. So I feel like the soul of time is a way of phrasing that idea. And I feel like that's what she tries to do in the book. She tries to solve the problems of her mother and her grandmother in her own lifetime. Yeah.
And she asks the coin about the title of the book, if the book should be called The Soul of Time.
And it says yes, and she said, isn't that a bad title? And the coins say yes. And she says, does that mean I have to have a bad title for the book? And the coins say yes.
Yeah.
And I did have that question, like, should I call it The Soul of Time? But then I thought, it's okay, like the title can be something outside the book in some way.
Okay. So, Kristen, let's talk a little bit about Cat Person.
Sure.
Inevitably. So, I'm not sure how many people here read Cat Person. Maybe we could have a show of hands to have an idea. Okay, about half, I guess. So one of the topics of Cat Person is relationships in the electronic age, online relationships that develop through text messages, especially, which is the case of these two characters. There's Margot, who's a very young woman. She's 20 years old. She meets this not older, but the man whose age she's not sure about. She knows that he's older than her, but she has no idea. She's too young, actually, I think, to guess his age. Because when you're 20, you don't know if someone who's 28 or 35 or 40, how old they are, and she's confused. So he's 34, they meet, and they exchange numbers, and they start texting each other. And expectations build in these texts. So I'd like to know the role of these text messages in the final failure of their relationship, if there is any, and what it is.
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting listening to people discuss the story. I think it says a lot often where people sort of decide that things went wrong, you know? And I think definitely there's a piece of it that's lodged in the text messages. I didn't think of the story when I was writing it as an indictment specifically of technology, but I can see how it can be read that way. They meet in person, but yeah, there's this long period, essentially, of courtship where they're flirting back and forth via text. And I think what that does for Margot, and what I do think can often happen in real life, is that because she only has these little sort of bursts of evidence of who he is, these little fragments of jokes and references, it gives her a lot of space to kind of imagine the person on the other end of that conversation without necessarily having the full weight of who he is. And so, as I think maybe often happens to everyone, but maybe particularly to like someone with a good imagination who kind of prides herself on being able to read people, she constructs an idea of a guy. And then when she meets him, there's this really interesting kind of collision between the person she's imagined and who he wants to be, or she wants him to be, and also maybe, because this is a part of it too, the kind of person he was trying to suggest that he was, the performance he was living. And then there's the reality of him. And over the course of the night, you watch as those two kind of like rub against each other, and she continually is like assessing and trying to decipher, who is this guy? What that I thought about him is real, and what if it isn't? And I think, yeah, I think it's a dynamic that I think absolutely, if you met someone at a party and they gave you their number and then you talked on the phone, you could do the same thing, right? You could invent.
Or letters, could be
exactly,
letters.
Exactly. So it's not brand new, but I do think the intensity of it, the sort of quickness of it, that kind of text flirtation that is really pleasurable sometimes, I think most of us are familiar with, but can kind of give you a false sense of security of knowing someone that can then lead you to misread them. Yeah.
And I think he also builds a narrative in his head of who she
Exactly.
is, right? It's not just one way.
Exactly.
And then when they meet, the chemistry just doesn't work. But she goes on with it because she has this strong idea in her mind of who he.
Right. And I think it's true too when you think about it. Like, who's to say that if we were writing letters, would you say that the person who in the letters isn't the real person, and the person in front of you is? Like, you might say, like, a person who can make funny jokes by text has the capacity for a sense of humor. I don't think it's as simple as one was fake and one was real. It's that she just can't know what's real. And that anxiety really builds and builds over the course of the story.
And then she doesn't know when to stop.
Yeah.
I mean, she knows it's not going to go right. The chemistry is all wrong, but she just doesn't know when.
Yeah, she sort of talks herself out of it. She has that realization several times and then kind of walks it back or criticizes herself for being shallow and thinking that when she ought to know him better or spend more time with him.
One thing that I was curious about is the reaction of readers and also reviewers when they read the book when it came out in the New Yorker in 2017 and in the middle of Me Too, and then when they read it, because the book was launched in 2019, right? So when they read it in the sequence, because to me, when I read it a second time and a third time in the book, I read it differently, even though I knew, of course, what was going to happen. I read it sort of like a horror story.
Yeah.
Because you have this girl who's very young and a guy who's much larger than her. She doesn't really know him, and she gets into his car. She doesn't have a car. And they drive to a kind of remote place, an empty house. There may be cats. I mean, it's really like a horror, the structure of a horror story. And you're reading and you're thinking, don't do that. I mean, don't get into this car. Just did you think about that?
Yeah.
Or did people react in that way when they read it in the book?
There was, I thought, a very sort of clever reader on Twitter. I remember when the story first came out, who was like, it's like watching a horror movie, and you're like, don't go into the house, don't go into the house. And the girl keeps going into their house, and you're like, ah. And so, yeah, I mean, and in context, I do think you can see that horror imagery and horror structure is all over the rest of the stories. So I do think that's much more visible in the context of the full collection than maybe it was when people read the story in isolation. But that was one of the goals that I had for the book as a whole, was for that feeling of dread and horror, which is sort of natural to find in the pages of a story where a girl is biting someone or murders are happening, to like attach that to the more mundane, to collisions that might on their surface feel less consequential, and see if I could raise the stakes so that I feel like one of the things that often is true about dating, and especially as a young person and maybe as being a woman in the world, is that the feelings seem so much bigger than the circumstances that inspire them. And I feel like the reaction to Cat Person that people had, that sense of like, yeah, I felt that horror, and it's been really hard to explain why, is a really satisfying match between sort of structure and emotion. Like, it feels horrifying, it feels horrible. That's something you can say, even if you're like, and yeah, it was just a bad date with some kind of messy sex.
I think it feels bad for both characters. I mean,
Yeah.
if you can read it and you feel bad for him and you feel bad for her and you feel bad for.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think when men reacted to the story, there was a really wide range. And it has always seemed important to me to be like, yeah, if you're a man reading that story and your feeling is, this is horrible, like, I hate the idea that I might have slept with someone who felt this way, I think that's totally legitimate. Like, of course you would react that way. I think the question of then what do you do with that discomfort is a really open one and varied really widely. Like, some people, men, would read the story and say exactly that, and other people turn it outward and are like, she did wrong, she should have said something, why didn't she say anything, it's her fault that the story is making me uncomfortable. Or they're emailing me and saying, it's your fault that this story is making me uncomfortable. But the discomfort, I think, is absolutely there and available, like, is both Robert and Margot's.
Yeah. Maybe we should explain, because not everyone
yeah,
read it,
sorry.
what the discomfort is.
Yeah, so, essentially, Margot, this young woman, is going on this date that's going increasingly badly, and she's starting to feel like, oh, I don't know if I want to be here. He's kind of a jerk. He's like a little awkward. It's just going badly, but she wants it to go well so much that she sort of keeps going along with the date, lets him kind of move it forward, and even pushes it forward on her own. And then there's this moment where she's at home with him, in bed with him, and they're about to have sex, and she thinks, I don't want to do this. Like, I feel like physically kind of ill at the prospect of going through this, but she can't figure out a way to say that. And the reason why she can't, like why she makes the decision to essentially just go through it with it anyway, as opposed to leaving, I think is a really complicated one. But essentially she does, and then afterwards she feels awful, and she ghosts him, right? And he, in turn, reacts really poorly to that, and like, they clash. But I think that question of like, does the person I'm with really want to be here is a really fraught and kind of open one. And Margot has a lot of complicated reasons for making the choice that she does, and I think people reacted really strongly. It's funny to me to think that there were many people who it had never occurred to them that like a young woman in that moment might feel that way and might respond the way that she did. That was unsettling, and I wanted that discomfort to be in the story, like I said, but I recognize that it's
Were there
messy.
any women who reacted like
Oh
that?
yeah, definitely.
Like, I never felt like that's never happened to me.
Yeah. I mean, mostly people, if they were talking to me, said they could understand it. I'm sure more people said separately or privately that they couldn't. But yeah, there were some. One thing I did notice is that often, like I knew women, or I talked to women who were older, and a lot of them said something like, yeah, I was in that kind of situation, but I can't believe that like younger women would end up in that place. I had a woman
I thought that.
Yeah.
Exactly that. I thought
Yeah.
This is still happening.
Right, or like why? I think a lot of that objection was like, I wish it weren't true, to which I could say, of course, yes, I also wish that.
You wish it weren't true.
Yeah, I mean, that it's a terrible situation. Like, there's nothing
Yeah.
about that story that works out well for either of them, although I think at best Margot has a moment of kind of self-awareness and self-reflection where she's like, oh, I don't know why I did that. And I do feel like in any character, like that, those are the moments where like there's growth, right? Where she looks at herself and is like, that person I don't understand them. I want to, and that it does seem to me, if there's any like hope in a dark story, it is in that moment of like, something is gone wrong here. I need to understand
shouldn't do
why.
this anymore. Okay,
Yeah.
Maybe in the future she's not going to do
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, maybe.
So Sheila, you said you were saying that when you were looking for things to read in order to write your book, that you can find many things. The same thing happened to me when I was preparing. But one book that I did find is a nonfiction book that you probably know called Selfish, Shallow, and Self-Absorbed, about writers. It's 16 writers talking about the decision of not having children. None of them want children. So it's 13 women and 3 men. So I want to ask you about the title, Selfish, Shallow, and Self-Absorbed, because this is one of the accusations that women who don't have children usually get. But also something that I noticed is that most of the women writers, the female writers in the book, feel compelled to say that they don't want children, they never wanted children, but they love children. They have nephews, they like their neighbors' kids, they love their friends' babies, and none of the 3 men in the book say anything about liking children. They're completely unapologetic about not wanting children. It's just they don't have to say anything else. So I would like you to comment on both things, both the title, that women are called selfish, shallow, and self-absorbed, and this idea that you have to compensate somehow. You have to.
Well, it's the same thing. I mean, women, because you can have children if you can, because your body can do it, there's something wrong with you if you don't want to do it. You know, and those adjectives, selfish and self-absorbed, and what was the other one?
Selfish, shallow.
Shallow and self-absorbed.
Yeah. Shallow.
For not having undergone motherhood, for not having had the depth that experience brings you. The assumption is that is the only experience that can give you that kind of wisdom, or that if you don't have children, you're stuck in one place. You're sort of an adolescent forever, and which is absurd. I mean, things happen to a person for their whole entire lives that bring you all sorts of wisdom if you want. And selfish, yeah, that you're spending your time on yourself. I mean, but I think that is changing because with the world in the state it's in environmentally, I don't think we anymore could really say that it's selfish to not have children. I think more and more people are thinking, well, is it selfish to have children? Is it selfish to add to the human population at this moment in history with the climate crisis and so on? And there isn't the question of why do you have the children? I mean, the reason you have a children is for yourself. The same reason you don't have children, that's also for yourself. So why is one more selfish than the other? As well, if you don't have children, there's so many ways to contribute to their world. There's so many ways to love the world. There's so many ways to express care. There's so many people to take care of in the world. There's just so many tasks that the person that doesn't have children can attend to with the entirety of their time and their being. So I don't know. To me, it feels like a very old-fashioned sort of judgment that I think might be changing. But yeah, I think the reason the women say that they love children is because they don't want to be seen like a monster, like you're a monster if you don't have children and if you don't love children, and there's something unnatural about you, and they want to say, well, no, I am natural, I do love children, you know.
I just don't want them, but,
yeah,
but they're cute, they're
I'm
wonderful,
still human.
they're lovely.
Yeah.
One thing, that was my next question that you already preempted, that I remember when I was about 7, my best friend told me that her aunt, who never had kids, would never grow old, because she never had kids.
Right.
She wouldn't grow old as my mother would, as her mother would. And that stuck to me, you know, that this person would never grow old. She's almost 80 now, and in my mind, she's like 30.
Right.
she never grew old. So there is that. That's also something that women who don't have children have to deal with, the idea that you're never an adult.
Yeah.
Like having children for a woman is a door into adulthood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot of mothers who aren't adults, who aren't.
It's very easy to make a baby. So
Yeah.
you don't need to be an adult. You can be 14 and have a baby. It has nothing to do with being an adult or being mature. There's a question about your creative process here. If you create games to stimulate your writing, or the people who in your other book, How Should a Person Be, are they, if they're real or if they're fiction? And you said that they were based on your friends, but they were actually like a reality show. And if this influence of having these games comes from theater, from your experience as a playwright?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, I studied playwriting, and I wanted to be a playwright. That was the first thing that I wanted to be. And I felt like writing How Should a Person Be was in a way what I missed about theater, which is being with other people for a certain amount of time and collaborating with them and creating something together and becoming so intimate with each other. And there's a kind of performance, and the book felt like a document of the performance. So I feel like that book really is very close to theater. And you know, when the book was done, I felt that same kind of mourning that you feel when you do a play, and then you become a family with the other actors, and then the play closes, and you're like, well, I'll never see them again, or at least we'll never be together as a group again. And yeah, I mean, I do think The Coins was a game, and that's why it's always funny when people ask me, like, did you change any of the answers from yes to no? And it's like, well, that's just cheating at the game. Like, that's no fun for me. You know, it's fun to play the game according to the rules. And I mean, writing to me is very playful. I mean, it's difficult work sometimes, but there is a sense of play, and there is a sense of playing a game by myself, and it's my favorite kind of game to play. You know, can I make this object and put it into the world and have it become part of the world in the way that I imagine? And even before that, like, can I get whatever this vague image in my head is onto the page in words? Like, because for me, when I start to write a book, I don't have characters, I don't have plot, I don't know what's going to happen. I just sort of have, it's almost like a color or a mood or something that can't actually be translated into a book. So the translation, it's never going to be what that original image is. And yeah, I just think, I think with my current book, there's another game that I'm kind of playing, which is different. Like, I've been doing this thing where there's the text-to-speech website, and so I've been putting the writing into the text-to-speech and then listening to it as though it's a story being told to me, and I have it in a British man's voice. And it's neat because the last book that I listened to on an audiobook was What is Art? Tolstoy wrote a book called What is Art? And it was narrated by this British narrator, a man. And so when I listen to my book, I feel like it's a continuation. I'm like, would Tolstoy say this? You know, it's, anyways, it's always fun for me to have these strange processes. Not strange, but that just make every book feel like a different project, a completely different project from the one before.
So it's not an electronic voice, it's like a real voice.
No, it's an electronic voice. I mean, it's a computer.
It's like Siri, but a man and British.
Yeah, exactly. It's not perfect, but it's close. It's better than getting a British man into the house to like read to me.
Yeah.
Maybe that would be better, but I don't think that's
you
possible.
could have one in your basement, like the character in
that's right.
in Kristen's story. There's a character where there's a story where there's this woman who finds a book of witchcraft in a library, and she comes home and she starts doing the first spell, I guess, and with, you know, herbs and whatever, a lock of hair, and then suddenly there's this man who materializes naked, beautiful man who's naked in her basement. And then horrible thing happens. I'm not going to say anything. So there's a question for you here from the audience. If you could talk about where the inspiration came for the Night Runners.
Sure.
And explain what the Night Runners are.
Sure. So, the Night Runner is a story in the collection you mentioned at the beginning that's a little bit of an outlier in the sense that it's set in Kenya, which is where I worked as a Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years. And the premise of the story is that a man, also a Peace Corps volunteer, who's having trouble controlling a classroom full of girls, starts being harassed by a figure of legend called the Night Runner that will come to his house and sort of bang on his door and leave disgusting relics around. And that was inspired originally by a story that I was really told by the family that I lived with. One of the things that they really enjoyed doing was sort of telling me stories that existed in a kind of like where they kind of laughed at my inability to figure out whether I should believe them, right?
But they told you a story about the guy who was
they told me a
harassed, or
story
the
about
Night
Night
Runner?
Runner. So
The Night
basically,
Runner,
the idea is that a Night Runner is someone in the community who is possessed by the desire to strip naked at night and run around to people's houses, basically harassing them. And they told me all these details. They were like, it's it's hereditary. People inherit from their parents the desire to be a Night Runner. And I said these sort of like, really, like, come on, is it like an urban legend? And they were like, oh, I don't know, but no, it's real. It's definitely real. Watch out for the Night Runners. And it was fun. It was just a story. And so the story, the figure has a different role in my story, right? Like, I invented the character and the reasons that he's being harassed. But it's funny, though, because long after that Night Runner story or the main character in the story, who turns out to be a night runner, spoiler, is named Grace. And after the book was already out, someone sent me a link to a BBC Kenya documentary where they had gone into a village and stalked a night runner with a camera, and the woman's name was Grace. And I was like, oh my God, I predicted the future. And so yeah, it was, as all the stories are, sort of inspired by something real and then took on a life of its own.
So it was true. There are night runners.
There are really night runners, and I think, yeah, but I think all those things, right, here and everywhere, exist in a space between reality and not. So like there is the phenomenon of the night runner, and then there's all the stories that people tell about them, and like the kind of role they play when you're telling your kid, like, go to bed, the night runners are out, like is a different kind of thing.
The night runner is going to get you.
Yeah.
There's a question for you. Is imagination the opposite of expectation for you?
I think we could both try and answer that question.
you can both answer. That's
You go for
it.
Is imagination the opposite of expectation? I mean, that's deep. I guess so. Yeah. I think to make something that is genuinely surprising, you have to keep expectation in mind, right? And I think knowing, and from a craft perspective at least, what people are going to expect is a prerequisite for figuring out like what is the unexpected thing if I want to, and where do I want to deploy that. So yeah, I think absolutely. But at the same time, I don't know, like so often my imagination can run along really well-trodden ground, right? Like sometimes our fantasies are the most like ordinary and boring and sort of expected things about us. And so I think sometimes one of the things the trying to do when I'm writing is be like, where does this fantasy come from? The passage that I read starts with like imagine, right? And that's an unexpected fantasy. Very often the fantasies people are imagining about their coworkers are much more mundane. So sometimes is the answer.
Yeah. How about you?
I find the word imagination really confusing. I'm not sure what it is. I have this book called Children Tell Stories, and it's from 1976 or something, and it's these people, I guess social workers, went and got children to tell them stories, and the children range from 2 years old to 7 years old, and the stories are incredible. They're like 4 sentences long, when they're 2 years old, but the stories are like, the mummy hit the boy. The mummy was very angry at the boy. The boy fell off his bed, and then the mummy kissed him goodnight. And they're all like clearly taken from these kids' lives in this very traumatic way. Like it's all like the worst thing that happened to them in the last month is what the story is. And sometimes it's like the cat was hit because he asked for an extra cookie. Like it's all, they transpose themselves into an animal. And so this like term that you mentioned, autofiction, always seems so strange to me because it all seems like the same thing. Like all writers draw from their lives, and all writers change it a little bit. Like even non-writers, even like 2-year-olds who are just like in a nursery are doing what we would call autofiction, just being like the mummy hit the boy. So I don't know where the imagination comes in, and I'm also like curious, like when does it come in? Like why would the child change the boy to the cat? Like is that an attempt to hide, or is that an attempt to like expand the story or the self? And this thing that I'm writing now, I think like has more like so-called imagination in it. Like it has more clear invention, but at the same time, like it feels just as autobiographical as anything else, because it's always where you are right now, always where you are emotionally, like in the most extreme emotion of the last month or whatever. So yeah, I don't know if imagination is the opposite of expectation. That's something to think about all night long.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just one, we have time for only one question that I wanted to ask you, Sheila. What does writing your own name and your friend's name in the book as characters do to your writing process? Does it change it?
Yeah, so when I did that, Margot, when I was writing How Should a Person Be, a lot of the book started with transcripts. So I would tape Margot and I talking, and then I would transcribe us. And I didn't quite know if it was going to be in the book. I just wanted to the reason I was taping and transcribing was because the previous book that I'd written took place in the end of the 1800s in Boston, and it was this very formal, kind of very literary sort of sentence, kind of Henry James-ish. And so when I started writing How Should a Person Be, I wanted to remember, I wanted to know on the page what it really looked like, how we really talked, what kind of sentences actually come out of our mouths. And so that's why the transcribing happened, to start writing sentences in a new way. And the way you transcribe is you're like, Margot, da, 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 Sheila, da, 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 Margot, Sheila, da. And when I started pulling the book together from all these different materials that I'd written and collected, there came a point where Margot and Sheila were just the names. And really the question was like, not why are those the names, but why didn't I change them? And I asked myself at a certain point, like, should I change the names? And I tried to, and it just looked wrong. Like it looked like a mask, and it looked like a kind of unnecessary mask. And I talked to Margot about it, and I was like, I don't know if I should change the names or not. And she said something that always stuck with me, which is that she said, we're safer if you don't change the names. Because if you change the names, it looks like everything is true, and we're trying to hide, and we're vulnerable. But if you don't change the names, it's just weird, and no one knows what's true and what's not true, so we're less vulnerable that way. And I thought that was really smart, and so that was one reason that I kept the names. Yeah, and also just because it looked wrong on the page, I'd be like Margaret and Shelley. I was just like, who are they? You know? So, but one thing that it did, like the question is like, what did it do to not change the names? I think it was really, really difficult for our friendship and for Margot, because she's a painter and she has a successful career as an artist in her own right. And after the book came out, it got a lot of attention, and people would say to Margot, "Oh, are you the Margot from Sheila's book?" And I think that was hard. Like, she didn't want to be my creation, any more than I would have wanted to be her creation. So I think that was hard. That was the hard part, was once the book was in the world and it was taken away from this like private little bubble of games and playing, and it became, it started to impact her life. It came out in 2010, and it's, I guess, almost 10 years later, and I feel like we're just sort of getting back to some kind of equilibrium. It was... I'll never do that again.
You mean in your friendship?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I mean, Miles, the boyfriend's name is made up. I didn't call the narrator Sheila. Like, I really wanted to keep the names out of this book because I saw what it does create a spell over your life and the people around you.
Yeah. So we're out of time. Just if you didn't get to ask a question, I'm going to be interviewing the two of them separately on Saturday at the Instituto Moreira Salles, so you're all welcome to come. And that's it. We're out of time, so thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here.